All right, welcome to another episode of Justice for Y'all. Here, as always, I'm Paul Painter with Stephen Morrison and Andrew Bowen, and with us today, we're honored to have our very first guest of our podcast, Lieutenant Colonel Phillip Peche, who is also a lawyer and a Marine Corps, had a career as a Marine Corps helicopter pilot. And we're here today because we've had an awful event happen just last night in a plane crash, which we'll talk to you about and everyone's heard about by now. And we want to get some insight of what may have happened or what the investigation is going to look like. So, Andrew, why don't I turn it over to you and you can introduce Phil and we can talk a little bit.
You're tuned into the podcast where justice meets Southern hospitality. Broadcasting directly from Savannah, Georgia, join your hosts, Paul, Stephen, and Andrew of Bowen Painter Trial Lawyers as they chat about the legal difficulties you might face in everyday life. From the ports of Savannah to the busy highways that stretch through the Southeast, we're your go-to source for all things legal. Served up with a dose of Southern charm and commitment to justice for y'all.
Talk a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, we're here because last night, about a little after 9 p.m. In Washington, D.C., American Airlines Flight 5342 suffered a collision with an Army Black Hawk helicopter while the American Airlines jet was on final approach to runway 33 at Reagan National Airport. This was our first major commercial airline tragedy in this country since, I think, 2009. So we've had a tremendous record of safety in commercial air travel, but unfortunately that came to an end last night. So we're going to talk about this and hopefully answer some questions or at least highlight some questions that need to be answered as the investigation of this crash goes on. And for that purpose, we have Phil Peche here. Hey, Phil.
You hear us all right?
How's it going?
Good. Phil, as Paul mentioned, is a Marine Corps helicopter pilot. When he was in active duty in the Marine Corps, he was a Chinook pilot. Is that right?
Smaller version of the Chinook. It was colloquially the Frog or the Sea Knight.
Okay, and that's the that's the two. The helicopter's got two rotors, one in the front, one in the back.
Yes, that spin in opposite directions and overlap.
All right. And correct me if I'm wrong, Phil. In addition to being a helicopter pilot, you also were a military crash investigator as part of your duties in the Marine Corps. Is that correct?
Yes, I was trained to be an aviation safety officer in naval aviation. And a large part of that was safety culture and crash investigation.
Okay.
And I've served for, off and on since 2003, doing some function for at least 15 years of that.
Okay. And have you actually investigated fatal aircraft crashes?
I have.
Okay. And then yet another hat that Phil wears today is as a lawyer. He is a lawyer who handles aviation disaster cases as part of his practice. And in fact, currently we are co-counsel with Phil on a helicopter crash case that's pending in Los Angeles, California, arising out of a tragic crash where our client was a flight instructor and she was on a flight training flight with her student pilot when unfortunately that helicopter suffered a massive failure in midair, and nobody survived that. But Phil, we've talked about you. Why don't I give you a chance to give us a brief bio of yourself, particularly as it relates to giving us insight into what happened here with this crash up in Washington, D.C.
Sure. And first, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. One service member to another, Paul, who I've known since high school, and then Andrew and Stephen, who I've litigated with. Andrew, we've tried cases. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, it's our
Thank
pleasure.
you for that introduction. Yeah, I went to high school in Savannah, Georgia at Benedictine Military School with Paul. Then I did Naval ROTC at Boston University, went into the Marine Corps, went through flight training, selected helicopters, became a naval aviator a few weeks after 9/11, and then flew multiple tours in Iraq, the invasion, and then a subsequent tour, flying a lot of medical evacuation, um, flying in urban areas at night where there's a lot of cultural lighting and the air traffic control, especially in the greater Baghdad area where we would have to fly quite a bit, was people were operating in different ways, in different light configurations, on different frequencies, and it was very much a see and avoid environment. So I have experience in that. I've analyzed nighttime type crashes before, and then I uh, left active duty and went to law school, and now I have the pleasure and the honor of doing aviation cases. And we linked up, geez, a few years ago, doing
Right.
some cases, and this was one of them. The helicopter crash. So does that does that bring us up to speed?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as a pilot yourself, a helicopter pilot who has flown in nighttime conditions in urban areas, and as a crash investigator. Well, first, let me make sure. I assume that you have had a chance to look into the facts of this particular case, the American Airlines crash up in D.C. a little bit.
I have, and I will say that there are a couple of sources. One that you all actually provided me, and please make sure that I quote this right. The Juan Brown report, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. There is also another podcast that I'm waiting to review called The Pilot Debrief.
Okay.
That one may or may not be out. I used to view it on TikTok, and I'm not. Um, I'm just chilling out on TikTok for the moment.
Fair enough.
But that's one that I do want to see,
All right.
and those gathered together a lot of facts very, very quickly.
Okay. So,
That
all right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that I could synthesize very, very briefly
Right.
that
That's what I
stand
wanted.
out
I
to me.
wanted to ask you basically, what do we know now without speculation?
Yeah,
We can speculate a little bit later, but let's talk about what are the facts as we know them right now.
And this is less than 24 hours after the crash, so we're brand new into this. But what do you got?
yeah. So first, this is a very complicated airspace. The DC area to the north of Reagan has prohibited airspace. There's only a few places in the entire United States that have prohibited airspace. Um, what everybody knows, if you have seen the video, and I suggest if you have a way to show it during this podcast, you show it. What you can see is one very bright light, and that bright light is the fixed wing aircraft. I did not write down the exact type of that aircraft.
It
I'm
was
sure
a
we'll.
CRJ, which is a regional jet that's operated by American Airlines.
Right,
It's about a 60
right,
passenger jet.
right. So one thing that is interesting is, that jet is on an IFR flight plan, most likely because that's what almost all commercial carriers do, which means instrument flight rules, which means positive air traffic control at all times.
Okay, what do you mean
So,
by positive air traffic control?
meaning controllers are telling them what to do. They
Okay.
can approve what they've already filed, they can give them guidance, pilots can make requests. But what we do know was that the regional jet was cleared for the 01, I believe, ILS approach. I believe it was a precision approach.
And can you describe what that is?
Yeah, so a precision approach means you have a way via either instrumentation or air traffic control telling you to give you glide slope information. So you can know exactly in space if you are on glide slope for where you should touch down, right? So on an approach, but the issue is given a clearance to fly that approach, but then circle to land at a runway that I believe is 330. So if you look at the video, if you want to show it, you may want
Yeah,
to
we're pulling
play
up right
that.
now to show it.
Yes, Shannon and Paige, there are
Yeah.
multiple.
So I will do this. We're doing this live, as they say. Try to keep
Okay,
the audio
there it is.
down. So,
All right, Phil. So we've got some video, and as you mentioned, you got it now, Stephen.
yeah, this is
Stop it right there.
all right.
Well, that's
That's the moment of collision.
right, and back up just a little bit.
And you can probably share your screen with Phil, and he can point out using his computer.
We're taking this to warp speed on
Okay.
the technology side. Okay.
So,
Nice.
can you see this, Phil?
No, hang on.
All right.
No
he's not
time
sure.
like the present.
All right, share that screen. Zoom.
I've got to stop the recording if I do that.
Okay. Well, Phil, you've seen the video. We're going to have it up here on this screen.
Okay.
And as you described, well, first of all,
Give
just
me
above
1 second.
there's a round bright white light just above the horizon on the right side of the screen, and then above that there are 3 lights. And my understanding is that those 3 lights are another aircraft that was not involved in that crash, and the jet that you're talking about is the bright light that's just above the horizon in this video frame. Does that meet your understanding?
I would say since we have seen this, now we're looking at the same video. I agree with you. If there is a bright light, pretty close to the horizon,
Mhm.
and then to the left, as you're looking at the screen, there is a much smaller light
Right,
that
and I
you
think if
can
you hit
make
play,
out
Stephen,
if
we'll
you're
start to
looking
see
for
that.
it.
And that smaller light is the helicopter, correct?
That is the helicopter. So here is what happens. And in real time,
Cam's observation.
trying to put a lot of information out there, regional jet cleared. This approach can happen. It does happen there. But it is not a conventional straight precision approach that you're flying all the way on glide slope,
Right.
right? So when you're given circling, part of circling is you have to have the runway in sight. So you are then mostly on a visual approach, and it's a lot more hands flying more likely than automation,
Okay.
which pilots these days don't often do as much. I'm not making any suggestions here because I don't have enough information, whether the approach was completely automated. But the point is kind of a non-standard approach.
Right.
Now, what do we know about the aircraft? Well, it's leaving from an area that's a unit that flies a lot of, you know,
And you're talking about the helicopter now,
distinguished
the
visitors.
Army Black Hawk.
Yes. That unit has a large part of it that flies throughout the national capital area, flying, not necessarily the president per se, that's HMX-1, but flying other people around,
Okay.
right? The interesting thing is what has been reported so far, and it may be worth somebody, when I stop talking, I might do it too. Google this, because the reporting that I saw said this was a training flight. And to me, that's interesting.
Okay.
And what Juan Brown reported was there is a way that air traffic control will allow a helicopter to sneak, basically come under the approach, under the point in space where any aircraft are on an instrument approach. And I believe the clearance was, and I don't know this yet, so this is a fact that I need to
Right.
I need to find out. I've heard as low as 200 feet. However, I've heard the collision was at 400 feet, with the regional jet.
So
But what we know
if your
is
information bears out to be true, what you're saying is that that helicopter had a ceiling of 200 feet in that area. Is that correct?
On the
I
floor.
don't know that yet.
Okay.
Is it
And that is why I want to hear exactly what the flight clearance was, because presumptively, and I have not personally flown in that area. So it's like I said, it's a convoluted process, but the tower frequency and the area around the tower means that a lot of people have to talk to tower. Tower is extremely busy
Now,
there.
I've heard some talk
So
that helicopters would be on a different radio frequency than the commercial airlines in that area. Is that so? The tower would have one frequency to talk to the commercial jets and another frequency to talk to the military helicopters. Is that something that you are aware of?
tower has multiple frequencies, right? The military, more so naval aviation, less Army and Air Force aviation, but still has UHF and VHF frequencies for the same thing.
Okay. Now,
So that is also an open-ended question in terms of what each one heard.
Right.
I haven't heard anything definitive and this would come, and this may be even worth Googling right now. What is the latest on what has been released of the air traffic control transcript
Right.
on which frequencies at what time? Because then they could track specifically the call signs to see what the other one knew. What I will tell you though, and this comes from several hundred hours in combat flying on night vision goggles. What I was flying on, 20 years ago, similar, what is available now, better. But if this was a training flight, and this was specifically a night vision goggle training flight, which it very well could have been, I don't know. That information's not out there. Um, on night vision goggles, if you only include in your scan what you see on the screens, you don't get color variation.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to look around, however many tubes you have at this point, you need to look around it in an urban area to differentiate colors,
when you
right?
say look
Because
around, Phil? Do you mean so you've got goggles on? Do you mean look around like outside the goggles, or do you change settings so that you can then see within the goggles beyond the
right. So if you can see, and you know what? At one point, I will put a helmet on, and maybe I'll show you guys. But the NVGs or the night vision goggles, or even if it's forward-looking infrared, which wouldn't help them in this, it could have. But if they're just wearing night vision devices that come down so that you can look at your flight instruments too,
Mm-hmm.
In the case that you fly into inadvertent bad weather and you need flight instruments to know your attitude, you can do both. But what I learned in flying around Baghdad, especially at night with all different kinds of aircraft, helicopters, um, C5s, commercial stuff, just flying at different altitudes, is you got to incorporate a scan that includes through your goggles, and then you position the goggles so that you can look up, tilt your goggles up and see straight ahead, or tilt down and see over the goggles and actually see what the cultural lighting is showing you.
Okay.
So you look at what it
Because
really
like
looks like.
why I
and
bifocals.
think
what-
this is critical is the relative motion of these two aircrafts. The aircraft. What we know, Tower said, called out the traffic to the helicopter. The helicopter acknowledged the traffic. Tower cleared them to go behind that aircraft, and they acknowledged it. But if this is a training flight and the landing light is down, which it is, that's the big bright
Mm-hmm.
light. If you're looking at kind of the greens, it's just brighter. That will blind. It makes depth perception of the night vision goggles, especially if you're just learning how to use them, makes it very difficult to judge relative motion. They heard cleared ILS runway 01, which assumes a straight trajectory coming down. That's probably what they thought they were going to see. But when the aircraft came to the right and maneuvered to circle, they weren't expecting it. And when they
Okay.
figured it out, it was too late. I do think that the training issue has to be thoroughly explored.
And when you say training, correct me if I'm wrong, military helicopter pilots are always training no matter how much experience they have, correct? So you're not saying that this was a novice pilot or a new pilot or anything like that?
No, no, that's why it needs to be clarified. It needs to be clarified as to what kind of, yes, there's all different types of training. Operational squadrons
it-
do require training.
So
There's
I
things
gotta-
that you
well,
have to
the
do
Secretary
to,
of Defense, I
Yeah.
think, came out with a statement and said it was an annual certification training. Does that affect your analysis? I just looked it up when you were
annual
talking.
certification training. If that means like an annual check ride, which I think is what that means,
Mhm.
just give me 1 second. Because the lingo across, you'd be surprised, the
Oh, yeah.
lingo across the
Branches
different
of service, yeah.
militaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
What
he's
did you
also
call it?
pretty new to the
Annual
job too. So.
certification?
Yeah, the Navy has very sophisticated language, and the Marine Corps communicates in grunts and hand
That's
gestures.
true. That's
generally.
very true.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. What'd you call it? Annual certification what?
Training.
Training.
And we've got some information from what was being relayed by the tower.
Well,
Go for
I'm
it.
not even sure. I mean, what we're talking about here will just really feed into what was going on in the deal, and it could have an impact on the cause or the contributing cause if it was an annual certification of an experienced pilot versus the first time this pilot has ever undergone these maneuvers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that makes a huge difference
Well,
on a
here
big
is-
picture.
Here's what I'm
Okay.
curious about.
So here's an important consideration in a midair collision case. And I have started litigation on one of these very early in my career, and I have been involved in investigating them. Right? The the mid-air collision, you have to know what type of clearance each aircraft was operating on. Remember when I was talking about positive control?
Mm-hmm.
If both of these aircraft are operating with an IFR clearance, and I don't know what the transponder code was for the Blackhawk. If it is squawking a specific code, that means it has an IFR clearance. Or was it just operating VFR where the pilots have the sheer responsibility to see and avoid?
Yeah.
And listen to this, Phil.
When
We
two
got
aircraft,
we have something from the tower that 30 seconds before the
great.
crash, air traffic control asked the helicopter if it could see, quote, PAT 25, do you have the CRJ in sight? And there was no response. And then there was another call, PAT 25, passed behind the CRJ. And the audio from the flight tracking sites doesn't record any response from the helicopter before the crash. So this article says.
What's that article, Paul?
It is live5news.com, which is out of.
Well, I think it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about the different. So we've talked about IFR versus VFR. I'm kind of understood where that plays in.
Right.
You've got a pilot in the Black Hawk. You've got a pilot and a first officer in the passenger jet, and you've got the tower. And the responsibility for safety and just the control of these aircraft coming through is shared among those group of people, but they're understood ways that is divided up. In terms of the air traffic controller, if it was visual flight rules, VFR for the Black Hawk does not rely on the tower to tell it where to go, basically. Is that right, Phil? If it's flying VFR?
Well, you typically cannot go into tower's airspace without approval of tower to do so.
Okay. So if the
So
Black Hawk is
at some-
entering into the tower's airspace, but it's
Right.
it's being told, do you have a visual on this CRJ? How does that play into VFR versus IFR? Does that matter? Or are those two different things?
Right. So, and again, knowing what the transponder code of the Black Hawk would answer this question for us, that's one more piece of information. But hearing that aircraft that are operating VFR that may request flight following, which is something that I would do typically flying on the West Coast, through busy airspace in Southern California, so that you do get call outs on air traffic control because they're following you so they can tell you traffic.
And they would tell you,
Right.
even though you're VFR, they would say, hey, maintain this altitude, maintain this heading, or switch altitude or switch heading, correct?
If tower gives you, and what I had heard, so this may be conflicting from reading the Juan Brown report or hearing the Juan Brown report, the Black Hawk did acknowledge.
That's what I heard
the
too. In
go
fact, I
behind.
heard the recording of that.
Yeah.
And he said, visual
so-
separation. I have visual separation.
Well, so there's a lot of different. It's a constellation of possibilities. Maybe that's what I had heard as well. So maybe let's just take it as that's what we understand based on what we know at this point to be the case. That the tower communicated to the Black Hawk. The Black Hawk acknowledged the CRJ. There's a question, and then they collided. So did he see it and then just ran into it? Did he see a different CRJ and it was a miscommunication or a misread by the Black? I mean, those are kind of the questions that start to
Or did
develop.
he think that it was half a mile further than it was because he was expecting it on the first runway as opposed to runway 33?
Or the goggle. So I think it's kind of gets to one of the questions I wanted to ask Phil as a helicopter pilot.
Here is
Well, let me just ask you this: what kind
duty.
of before we talk about the duties, the last just sort of piece of inputs they have, obviously visual flight, they are use their eyes, right? But if you are flying under VFR and tower communicates that there's another aircraft in the vicinity that you need to look out for, do they also have any kind of instrument they can at least refer to within the helicopter, that maybe a radar or something like that they could say, read on the radar or some other instrument that's to tell them, here is the location of another aircraft within the area I'm traveling?
Yes. So, and this was done very well on the Juan Brown report, going through the avionics package on the commercial jet. Would have a collision avoidance system, and I can't recall the specific details of it, but very broadly, above 1,000 feet, it would work and it would have alerts. Below 1,000 feet, that alert part of it was disabled for various reasons, and I don't know what those reasons are, but that can be, when tower is a busy airspace, right? When they tell a helicopter who's supposed to be low, and we still don't know what the max altitude was. I haven't heard that in air traffic control. And they say, okay, you have the traffic, and then tower clears you, because tower has to clear you to do things in tower's airspace.
Mm-hmm.
Tower clears you, go behind, you acknowledge that. Tower is then shifted its focus to the other aircraft that it has to control.
Right.
But in the tower, the ATC will get collision avoidance notifications. They absolutely will. So they will see it, but they're depending on the helicopters see and avoid, to be honest, because the other thing that you would want to hear, and I didn't necessarily hear, was the CRJ, the call sign, or the aircraft identifier for the regional jet. I didn't hear tower ever call out this helicopter traffic to them.
Mm-hmm.
And you would expect that when you were cleared to fly an approach to a runway and then execute circling, which requires a visual scan. It's a
And Phil, we lose him?
We lost Phil.
Hold on, we got to get him back.
Time for a commercial break.
Little intermission music.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Let's invite Phil to join us back.
let's do it.
All right, so we're back. We're back here with Phil Peche talking about the American Airlines crash that occurred last night. Phil, I've got a question. That from what you were telling me about the night vision goggles, they especially in an urban environment with lots of lights and stuff, they can make things more confusing. And then another potential aspect of the night vision goggles is, my understanding is, there's no depth perception when you're wearing those. So my question is, what is the advantage to wearing night vision goggles? Why are they wearing them? And then secondly, are they appropriate for all circumstances, or may they perhaps not be appropriate in this kind of environment?
Okay, so first off, night vision goggles have multiple tubes that you now look through, and that allows for depth perception.
Okay.
Right? The issue is night vision technology can't completely reproduce the sunlight. Right? So and it can't reproduce color, like color variation.
Right.
Because one of the biggest ways to see other aircraft at night is they have a very visible light signature.
Mm-hmm.
They have a red light, a green light, and a white light. And if you're not looking on NVGs, if you're not flying on our night vision devices, those are lights that you can see. And lights, we can triangulate and judge relative motion better.
Right.
If you're on night vision technology, what can happen is this aircraft had on also its landing light. That is a bright white light. Bright white light has a blooming effect on night vision devices, causes the your resolution to bloom out, you not to see it as well. And if it's not differentiating.
So why in the world would they wear these things to fly at night in this location?
Well, what I'm saying is it is still safer to do it. But what I learned having to basically fend for myself in a Wild West that was Baghdad in 2005, especially at night, was if you really want to know what's out there, you got to include a naked eye scan.
Okay. Explain why the
EEG scan with your instrument scan.
Well,
it's kind of, you just have to take in information in three different ways.
I
Is the way
understand
that I just
Before we move on, I think one thing that's important that most people listening probably will not have a really good understanding of is how difficult it is at night to judge the direction something else is going, especially if you're in a moving helicopter. This is the same thing we used to deal with as ships at night. Like you see the lights,
Exactly.
and you see the light picture, so that red and green and white, you can figure out which direction the whatever you're looking at is heading. But we used to call it CBDR, constant bearing decreasing range. So if you think about it, if you're standing in a highway and there's a headlight coming right at you, the bearing, the direction that light is staying steady. The range is decreasing, so it's going to hit you. Now, if you're moving, you don't have lanes, okay, like when you're out there. So if you're at an angle to where, think of a football player trying to tackle somebody on the sideline, you're going at them like that. Well, that light is going to stay in the same position and get closer to you, but it's very, very difficult to appreciate that the depth is getting closer at night. And especially with all that background light you talk about, it's hard to see it at all. But it's hard to tell whether a light is 20 feet away or 200 feet away or 2,000 feet away, because a light that's lit up really bright 2,000 feet away and a dim light 20 feet away can look exactly the same.
And these are not slow speeds. I mean, even in a landing and I don't know exactly how fast the helicopter was going, but helicopters and going in one direction, over 100 knots. I assume the plane is, at that point going at least, a couple hundred. I don't know, at least 150 knots.
Juan Brown does he does already using the publicly available open source ADS-B data, which is required on all aircraft now. He's done a good reconstruction here.
And
very
we're
interesting.
We're gonna put the link to Juan Brown with this website on YouTube. If you find us on YouTube, you can find the link there.
Yeah, and another one you want to look for is what's he called? Pilot debrief.
Right.
Okay. Hey Phil, let me ask you a question.
Another one.
Why?
Yeah.
We're talking about how dangerous this condition is, that these two aircraft were in the same vicinity. I think most of us think if there's a plane on approach, there's nothing in its way, right? Why would there be a helicopter in a glide path, a landing that low to the ground at a major airport like that? Why would that ever even happen? Because normally wouldn't they have the helicopter kind of fly over the runway, because they're landing on the runway? So if you're 200 feet above the runway, you're not where planes are going to be flying.
Right. Not necessarily.
Okay.
Because the aircraft, if it's on a glide slope three-dimensionally in space, if you're cleared to travel well under that glide slope. So for a helicopter, I can remember departure end of LAX doing that at 100 feet, because that's where we needed to be to make sure that we absolutely, no questions, would have
under their jets
conflicted by altitude, right? So it's important to see, but because here's the thing, right? You would agree with me, and regulation and law, when looking at this in various ways, because which law applies is going to be an interesting one here. In that DC area, in Virginia, in Maryland, is all contributory negligence. There will be issues with that, but everybody from the air traffic controller to these two specific aircraft, to the maximum extent they possibly should, see and either avoid or try to tell the other people how to avoid, right? Everybody should be doing that.
Right.
Tower should have told the commercial aircraft when it was cleared to circle, it should have notified them of the helicopter traffic in its vicinity. There is no communication that I see of that. And this non-standard circling approach, as I said very early on, hands more hand flying than automation flying. They're focused on flying. They're cleared for the approach. That's all they hear. They're cleared. That means they fly their approach. Their scan should be visual at this point, so to some degree, there's always a see and avoid. And in these contributory negligence kind of states, there is the last clear chance doctrine, right? Who had the last clear chance to do something, and there will be the NTSB, because of the proximity, because this is the first commercial crash, mid-air collision like this in some time, this one has priority. So it will be thoroughly investigated. Any data that they could get, cockpit data recorder, the black boxes, the anything from the engines, anything from everything that they get, they'll analyze it.
Well, Phil, you're starting to get into, I think, what we want to move into here is the law.
Yeah.
Here. I mean, we're four lawyers talking about this, and you brought up a couple of important things, but I think the first part of this is, people died. Most likely everybody involved. The last I saw, there were no survivors. They're still confirming that until they get a full count of all the souls. This is a tragedy, and the next question is going to be, what happens when a tragedy like this happens and there are multiple responsible parties? This is an aviation incident over airspace that's in different areas. So I think we should start talking a little bit about that.
Well, let's, Phil, really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your not special knowledge and expertise with us. Let's have Phil back and have a whole nother episode about that. We're running out of time here today. But something you said that is absolutely the first order of what's going on here, and that's the human tragedy. 67 souls lost their lives, leaving behind families and loved ones. And just want to say, God bless all the victims of this crash and their families, and our prayers go out to them.
Absolutely.
And thank you to the first responders, the folks
Thank you, Andrew.
Yep.
Are out there.
Well said.
All right. Phil, thank you again. Thanks to our guest, Phillip Peche. And thanks everybody for listening. This is Justice for Y'all, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Justice for Y'all, hosted by the attorneys here at Bowen Painter Trial Lawyers in Savannah, Georgia. If today's episode resonated with you, or if you find yourself needing legal guidance, remember, we're just a call away. You don't have to work through the difficulties of your situation alone. Visit our website at bowenpainter.com, that's BOWENPAINTER.com, or give us a call at 912-335-1909. We're here to serve you with the dedication and warmth only true Southern hospitality can offer. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you don't miss an episode. And tell your friends and family about us if they're ever in need of some legal insight. Take care, and remember that at Bowen Painter Trial Lawyers, we're committed to justice for y'all.